So my name is Deborah Acosta. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer for the City of San Leandro. The third Municipal Chief Innovation Officer in the country. I was hired in February 2013. And today there's only two of us in the Bay Area that I'm aware of, Jay Nath in San Francisco, and myself. And there's maybe about 10 or 12 of them around the country now. So we try to look at things in different ways. We're really dot connectors, I'd have to say, is what we're really good at. So I'd like to actually engage. You heard a lot about San Leandro today. I'd like to engage with some of the other cities here and talk about what they're doing in their cities around building innovation ecosystems, and really especially in the context of some of the things that we've learned here today. So I'm going to start with Michael at the end. If you could just introduce yourself and what your role is for the city of Berkeley, and what stood out for you today, Michael, in terms of the content today.
Okay, thanks, Deborah. It's a pleasure to be here. Michael Caplan. I'm the Economic Development Manager for the City of Berkeley, which means I oversee all the business development programs, work with a lot of our commercial district revitalization efforts. I oversee a number of joint initiatives with private industry and with the university and the lab, and also work a lot with Civic Arts. The Civic Arts program for the city is integrated into the Economic Development Office, so there's a lot of sort of efforts at urban placemaking and how you sort of activate public spaces. That's fundamental to our work. And what stood out to me today? Well, the level of intelligent conversation around innovation and sort of the paradigm breaking sort of ideas that are hard sometimes for us to translate to political leadership and city sort of bureaucracies. These are important ideas that have taken sort of the private sector by storm and have a substantial role to play in the public sector too, but that's what stood out for me.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thanks for sticking with us to the end here. And hopefully we'll do a good job of kind of synthesizing the different elements of today. I have the privilege of working for the city of Fremont, the fourth largest city in the Bay Area, and home to the next BART station, to get you a little bit further down the line here, in Warm Springs, which also happens to be the home of our newly branded Innovation District and home to Tesla Motors, which some of you may have heard of. I've been in the role for 3 years and having a great amount of fun in it, mostly because I feel the city really is reflecting these values of innovation. And it really is heartening, not to be alone in that, but to be in this kind of virtual city of 3 million people, all of which take innovation very, very seriously. So I think that one of the things that really struck me about the conversation today was that even though it's a very technology-driven conversation, that many of the comments really got down to the human level, and things like empathy were being thrown around and relating to people, and whether it was in a medical paradigm or whether it had to do with 3D printers, it really was about humans relating to one another. And I feel like that's so much of our role in government, and in particular economic development and innovation, where we kind of are serving that universal translator role in working with our business community, and then also working with our cohorts in government, and trying to get each side to kind of understand where the other one is coming from. And I have to say that that's getting easier all the time for a variety of reasons. But I was very heartened that was kind of an underlying theme throughout all of the different panels today.
Hi, I'm Krista Canellakis. I work for the Mayor's Office of Civic Innovation in San Francisco. The office was created in 2012 when Jay Nath was appointed the first Chief Innovation Officer in the country. And our office is really an office that thinks about how we can be a bridge to the innovation, the broader innovation ecosystem and the private sector, and kind of bring those new tools and methodologies into city government. So we're sort of, again, a translator also to figure out how can we really innovate and create new ways for the government to deliver services and improve lives of our residents. I've been with the office for about 1.5 years. I started as in our fellowship program, and I'm now more permanently with the office. And I think what inspires me most, and something that I heard from Espen earlier, was when he was talking about education and leadership, and how the importance of kind of creating entrepreneurs out of students. Well, something I think about a lot is how can we create entrepreneurs out of city employees? It's not a natural place for entrepreneurship and creativity, but I think there's a lot of opportunity to really build incentives and models and networks for people within the government to feel comfortable about being entrepreneurs. So.
I could talk for hours on that subject, but so I'm going to hold off on that for just a second because I'd like to find out a little bit more about how you're doing this in your cities. So there's a lot of talk here about ecosystems, and in terms of economic development, all of us are dealing with that in one way or another. And a lot of it when you're dealing with startups and established companies, when you're dealing with the private sector, it's about risk, right? So it's about taking risks. It's about failing, picking yourself back up, iterating. How are you working as cities, in your individual cities, with startups, and are you in that realm taking risks yourself? And what does that look like in order to help these businesses and to develop that ecosystem? I'll start with you, Krista.
Sure. So one of the things we do as an office is create sort of prototypes, so models for engaging with the startup community, with the nonprofit community, with designers, technologists. We're really lucky in San Francisco because we have this sort of just bursting with all of these companies and technologies that actually are really interested in working with the city. So a lot of what we do is try and design programs to channel that energy and enthusiasm and sort of align incentives so that in these programs, we're creating value for the city and at the same time for the startup or company that we're working with. So one of the programs I could talk about is the Entrepreneurship in Residence program. It's a program that we launched last year. It's a 16-week program where we brought in startups. We brought in 6 startups and matched them with 6 city departments. And over the course of 16 weeks, they came together and collaborated and were entrepreneurs together, the employees and the startups, to design a new prototype that was addressing a very specific city challenge. So we had gone around to all the different department heads and said, what is a really kind of vexing challenge that you've had a hard time finding a solution for that could maybe be solved by technology? And we put out those calls for companies that could potentially solve those issues. And it was really, really inspiring to see what was actually able to be accomplished in government over the course of 16 weeks. All 6 startups had really impactful outcomes. All the city employees, were really blown away by the opportunity that they had to work with these innovative companies. And also, I think we really helped to kind of foster this culture of experimentation internally, because the kind of scoped issue areas that each team was working on were really were priorities of the city and priorities of the department and priorities of the mayor. So, they were given the freedom and resources to really spend time and solve some of the challenges. And I can talk a little bit about specifics if you want to go into that.
But this is a perfect example of cities actually collaborating and sharing with each other, because Jay actually called me several weeks ago and said, hey, we have an opportunity to apply for a grant to expand this Entrepreneurship in Residence program because it's been so successful. So we'd like Oakland, San Leandro, and West Sacramento to actually be our partners in this. And he said, I know it's kind of mind-blowing. We usually think of Boston as our partner, or New York, but hey, we are here in the Bay Area. So this is actually a good example of how cities are thinking a little bit differently and learning to collaborate and share the good things that they're learning with each other. So Kelly, what about Fremont?
Yeah, well, we've been thinking a lot about how we serve kind of these two, what may seem like on the surface very disparate audiences, your startup community and then also your big heavyweights. And to be honest, the startup community is one that we are kind of just getting our arms around, and it really started with a phone call that we got from research company who told us that they had run a survey and they found out that Fremont was the #1 place for startups in the country based on per capita. And they said that they actually ran the results 2 or 3 times because they were like, wait, that can't be right. So they run the results again, and then every single time Fremont would come up as #1. And to be honest, we were just as surprised as they were, because your startup community sometimes is really hard to get your arms around. They don't have a sign over the front door, and many times they don't even have a business license, and because they're just not there yet. They'll get there eventually. But yeah, so it really is hard to get your arms around it. And then on the other hand, we've got, Fremont is a 90 square mile city that has these massive companies with thousands of employees. Everything from Tesla to Western Digital and Seagate and Boston Scientific and Lamb Research, and the list goes on and on. And but what we realized is that as disparate as these seem, what they all have in common is that they're about innovation. And so the question we really needed to ask ourselves is, what do we need to do to better serve our innovation community? And so we did a focus group session for a half day with kind of handpicked people from the startup groups as well as the large companies, and had them do what we called an innovation scorecard exercise. So we had a 60-point criteria, and they ran through the list and said, this is how we rank those 60 things in terms of how they help us be successful. And then we had them rank every single one of those 60 points about how good of a job Fremont was doing in terms of meeting those needs. And then where we had the biggest delta were the things that we decided were the things that we need to focus on. What was interesting about that list, that very short list of where there was the biggest delta, they were things like, late stage venture capital funding and better help navigating at the state and federal government grant level or regulation level. And it was making connections with educational institutions to help with workforce issues. So, for the most part, it was a list that we weren't playing in that space already. And so I kind of think of this as now economic development 2.0. The things that we used to focus on, which is mostly real estate and trying to find the company and stick them in the right spot, it's not about that anymore, because we know that most of our business growth is actually happening from the expansion of existing companies and growing those startups and also growing the large companies as well. And how we do that is by focusing on the areas where they're telling us that they need help. So it's kind of reinventing ourselves, innovating our own operation to better meet those needs.
Michael, so it's not your mother's economic development system anymore. It's
definitely not your grandmother's.
Yeah, it's definitely not.
And I just to echo that sentiment, I think that what's happening in the economic development field, at least in the East Bay, and I think much more broadly, is that people are changing the paradigm of how economic development is done. Berkeley, of course, is a triple helix community in the sense it was described earlier. We've got a strong university institution, we've got a very activist government and citizenry and business community. I would almost say it's a quadruple helix, because we also have, Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, which is another layer of potential engagement. And for many, many years, we never really realized the extent to which we were exporting innovation to the region and the world. That there was this funnel of, literally $1 billion pipeline of R&D in those institutions up in the Hill, in excess of $1 billion, and it was flowing through. And I think it was just about the time that the Energy Biosciences Institute was founded, and a joint bioenergy institute, J-Bay, it was looking at biofuels. This is in the sort of like 2007, 2008 period. We started realizing, my God, there's all this going on in our, all this stuff happening, and we weren't capturing it. We were not poised to help companies that were spinning out from this technology grow. So we developed a very, very close alignment with the Office of Technology Licensing at Cal and with the lab as well, and started thinking indifferently about it. And in terms of risk, something that we helped collaborate on, which is now something that's really fully managed by the university, is the Berkeley Skydeck, which is the first sort of accelerator that was created out of the university in Berkeley to capture innovation locally and help grow it and build an ecosystem that was sort of locally focused. And it's a longer story I won't go into right now, but it's a really good example of, we were actually the city of Berkeley was the first money in this project. And so I'm proud of it. It wasn't a huge amount, but being a public sector entrepreneur in the way that we were talking about, that is something that economic development offices need to be thinking about. But it's a lot of risk because you can be a little bit ahead of your citizens and your political leadership. You can't be too far ahead. You've got to make sure you're very closely aligned and try to educate them and bring them along so that what you're not doing is not challenging closely held and cherished assumptions of what your community actually is. And Berkeley has a lot of ideas of who it is, so as I'm sure you all know. So anyway, I think that's an example of how we've been able to engage and work. We've worked in other ways too I could talk about, but that's a kind of risk, that calculated risk, but we're doing more and more of it all the time.
Well, Michael, let's continue to explore that. What about civic engagement? Because if we talk about all of this really being, and I know that from the Kansas City playbook, and Bill alluded to it earlier today, it's 10% technology, 90% sociology. So it's about engaging the stakeholders and the citizens. It's hard to do. What is it that Berkeley is doing to make sure that their citizens, that their stakeholders are and it doesn't have to be perfect because none of us, we're all trying to figure it out. But what are you doing that you think you're doing pretty well, and what things have you learned from that process?
Well, one thing we've done is we've actually started having conversations with these entrepreneurs. We've inventoried all the startups that we can measure. And Jennifer Cogley is here in the audience today. She's gone around and literally she surfs the web every day to find new startups and to capture them, even if we don't know who they are and if they don't have a business license or whatever. We don't really care. We want to know about them. We want to reach out to them. So we've had conversations like that, which is really significant. And that's the relationship piece. We actually had a company come to us not long ago that was thinking about leaving for San Francisco, which it ultimately did. But there was a division within their leadership. And if we had not reached out to them early on and actually had a conversation with them, they invited us in and said, we want to stay, but we also know we might want to leave. So we actually were able to have that conversation. And in some instances, that's successful. Some instances, it's not. This was a company that had just gotten like $85 million in startup Series B funding. So it's like they were really on the road, and they made a choice to go. But so that kind of thing. I would say also in terms of the sociology of innovation, supporting the kind of placemaking activities that make entrepreneurs and young creatives want to be in your city. So we have an arts district, and we have a number of sort of new innovations in our arts program now to do more temporary art, animating the downtown streets, using the streets as public resources. We've got a piece of Burning Man art that was actually sponsored by a local property owner that's going to be installed in our BART Plaza. A guy named Alex Nolan did a huge bear made out of recycled escalator parts from the old Ross building downtown. And the bear is going to be right in front of the building. And temporary, but fun and playful and creative. And that's the kind of thing. I know San Leandro is doing a lot with the arts. I think that creating a culture where creative people want to be is a huge opportunity, and it's something that economic development, government can actually help facilitate.
Good, thank you. Kelly.
I wanted to talk about kind of engagement on two different levels. One is kind of engagement with our business community, but then there's also like engagement with the broader community who has to kind of buy into all this. And with the business community, that's a little bit more straightforward, although I think we're trying to be a little bit more creative in how we're doing it. And one of the ways that we're trying to do it is just to be more reflective of the values that we see in the startup community, which is, I think you've said this before, Debbie, and I'm going to steal it, which is being scrappy. We like to think of ourselves, at least as an economic development effort, very scrappy. And one piece of evidence in that is that we were tired of people having to go to our city website and try to find information from the morass of everything but the kitchen sink thing that you find on the government website. So we have a new business website that's called thinksiliconvalley.com, which was kind of a very scrappy, startup-y kind of thing to do, kind of to take that mantle and say, yep, we're right in the middle of Silicon Valley, and we're taking ownership of that name and going to put our business brand out there as that. And if you go to the website, and I hope you do, I think what you'll see there is that it's very much not your typical government website. For one thing, you can find like the people behind it. Like we're there, our faces, our LinkedIn profiles, how to contact us. It's so maddening when you go to these places, you can't find the person that you're looking for. And then we spent a lot of time just meeting with people one-on-one. We did over 50 business visits last year, bringing along our council member and our Economic Development Commission and our Chamber of Commerce and us, and with the goal of trying to meet people's needs. But maybe sometimes the more challenging thing to take on is this broader stakeholder community, your residents and people who have invested in your community in different ways. And I think for a lot of communities that's hard because business growth means change. And sometimes there's that NIMBYism that kind of defines interaction with your constituents that can be problematic. Although I would just say we've had an easier time of this in Fremont, mostly because we suffered 2 major losses as a community in the scope of 14 months, and that was a loss of about 7,000 jobs between the NUMMI plant closing and also Solyndra imploding. And so the combination of both of those things meant that as a community, they really understood the vital connection between business and quality of life. And if those both aspects aren't healthy, then you don't have a healthy community. And everybody knew somebody who was affected by that. And the result of that is now when we do our community survey and we ask people about the things that they care about, it goes like this, and this is not true, I think, in any other community except for ours. It goes police, fire, economic development, and then parks and potholes and everything else, but that's almost unheard of. Usually economic development doesn't even register as something that people care about, but in Fremont, people understand how vital that mix is to their quality of life and how they pay for things like police and fire and parks and so forth. So we've been very actively communicating with our community as well, but we found that they're a very receptive audience.
So I have to follow on that. Why is it that you think, what is it that causes your community to recognize the importance of economic development? Because you're right, that's extraordinary. It never comes up. Potholes is number one, crime. How did you do that? Or is it something you did? Is it something about the constituency yourself, the stakeholders? What is it that?
I think it actually was the loss itself. It was finding ourselves in a pickle, in a difficult position, and people not knowing, okay, what tenant could possibly backfill a 5 million square foot old auto factory? That's never coming back, right? Well, actually it did.
It did.
We got lucky. It wasn't because of our amazing economic development efforts, it's because it just landed, and it was such a perfect synergy because we actually already had a strong clean tech community, and there were a lot of reasons why it ended up making all the sense in the world. But I think people really understand how fleeting that can be. It can be here today and gone tomorrow, and understanding that you can't leave your economic development efforts to chance. It has to be a very thoughtful, thorough effort. And so I think people just understood that in a very personal way that maybe they don't in other places.
So really developing a platform, and we've heard that earlier, really developing a platform about how you do economic development, being very intentional and purposeful about it, and really communicating that to all the stakeholders. It's really important. Cool, thanks. Krista.
Yeah. So, I mean, on this topic of platform, that's really how we think about civic engagement. And we try to think about, it's a term that's used a lot, but we try and think about what are the assets that we have as a city that are unique to the city government, and how can we make those assets more accessible to our citizens, to our businesses, to our artists. And so we thought about that in a few different ways. The office really, when it was created, had a mandate to really open up government. And so one of the first things we did was open up, I think we're the first city in the country to have open data legislation, a city open data legislation. And so that was one asset that we opened up, and with a hypothesis that if you open up massive amounts of city data, that there could be a lot of businesses that were created out of that. And since then, I think we did it in 2009, hundreds of businesses have been created using our open data platform. We also are thinking a lot more about our physical assets. So our public sidewalks and infrastructure. And so our office led a program in partnership with the planning department called Living Innovation Zones, where we created a new type of permit that allows public institutions and companies to test out new ideas in our public realm. So The first one that we did was on Market Street. It's, I don't know if you've seen it, it's the 2 Exploratorium dishes between 3rd and 4th on Market. And Exploratorium was an amazing partner to come in, and they, it's really a space for them to innovate and experiment with new ways of interacting in the public space. And then I think the third asset, which we're really now focusing on, is the city problems. Like, the problems in city government are themselves an asset because there isn't much transparency into the types of issues that cities are struggling with necessarily from a public perspective. So with these different programs with the EIR program, the Entrepreneurship in Residence, we're really trying to figure out how to scope problems of the city so that you can create access for other people to help us solve them. Those are the few things we've done.
Along the lines of identifying your assets, one of the things that cities haven't been good at doing in the past is actually identifying the private assets, the private partners. And the cities have really undergone some traumatic financial changes over the last couple of years, especially with the loss of redevelopment money. And we've had to become scrappy startups, again, trying to figure out where these finances are going to come from. Here in San Leandro, of course, we've had a groundbreaking relationship with Dr. Patrick Kennedy, the CEO and founder of OSI Soft, who founded his company here in San Leandro 35 years ago. So a very unique partnership that not only funded the fiber optic loop, or the fiber that actually goes in the conduit, but actually is funding part of my job. I mean, that's very unusual, right? That doesn't happen too often. Any of you have examples like that of public-private partnerships that are something that you're doing today that you maybe would not have contemplated a few years ago? We'd like to start with that.
Well, there's a number of efforts. Probably the most significant effort in Berkeley is something we call the Berkeley Startup Cluster, which is it's a collaboration of the city, the university, as well as the Chamber of Commerce and the Downtown Berkeley Association. And the idea was initially to try to build the ecosystem in the near to campus area in a way where a startup or an emerging technology company or anybody who had an idea could like find the resources they need close to campus. So the idea was, to have a tool where you could find available office space, to find out, get links to available jobs, to hire if necessary, to find supportive services, an IP attorney or something like that. And we started hosting a series of meetups, and we did some pitch events that were co-sponsored with the Keiretsu Forum. We started creating, the idea was to always have things going on, like you find in other innovation hubs, to kind of create the juice. And to support this effort, in addition to putting money into it, creating a website, and creating other resources, we actually created a group of advisors. It's an advisory group, and it's essentially people who are either serial entrepreneurs, tech veterans, technologists, or people who have some particular knowledge, funders, for example, VC or angel people. And they have gotten together. We have some very distinguished people on it. But the criteria, in addition to having those credentials, that they live in Berkeley. Because the idea is that it's a civic mission, it's a public-facing mission, as well as being sort of a business mission. So, we all know we want economic development, but we also want quality of life. We want to figure out ways for the government to be more responsive and receptive. So it's been a really interesting initiative. I mean, 10 years ago, we wouldn't have even conceived of it. Wouldn't have, it's been the basis for a lot of the policy discussions. It was the basis for us now pursuing updating, fiber optic technology and deploying that, and Wi-Fi and all the kinds of things that, you'd think that Berkeley would be leading on this, but it, unfortunately, it hadn't been. But I'd say that we're rapidly trying to lead in new ways.
Great.
I'd love to kind of put out the idea that perhaps a public-private partnership in and of itself may be a limited definition. And the reason for that, I went to a conference recently where it was branded as, come learn all about public-private partnerships, which is typically known as P3, so public-private partnerships. But they were saying it's actually like the P5, and it's public, it's private, it's nonprofit, it's philanthropy, and it's also people. And then there was one speaker who got up there and he's like, yeah, I just finished this amazing like river park project in Atlanta, and it was like the P27. Because it took a lot more than like 5 different types of partners to pull that off. And I really do think that is our world. We're all living in a P27 environment where you need you need to draw in as many resources as you can. One particular area that we've identified that has a lot of potential for us is in the clean tech area. We have huge clean tech sector, most notably anchored by Tesla, but we've got about 35 other companies who are working across all parts of the smart grid value chain. And the city itself is so facility laden that there again is something that we can take advantage of and have companies deploy their technology in our environment and see if it works and have a place to show future clients what it might look like in the built environment, so we can offer that. And we're doing a demonstration policy right now that kind of paves the way so we don't have to painstakingly like renegotiate every single person who comes our way, but we kind of have a template and a sign off broadly from our leadership that this is something that we want to do. But my favorite examples are kind of the one-offs, the things that there isn't a template for, and a really fun example of that is and these are all things that come up from meeting with companies. So we were meeting with a company called AlterG, which makes the anti-gravity treadmill. So I guess like Kobe Bryant, like kind of recovered using his anti-gravity treadmill. But and that's been their whole audience, is really sort of like these high-end users, like football teams and other people who use them. But they were thinking that perhaps there was another audience for this, which is senior citizens. But they hadn't really had a chance to test it yet. And they're like, you guys have senior centers, right? I said, we sure do. We've got seniors and senior centers and senior-only apartment complexes. And so we made some connections, and they plopped down a few machines. And what's been amazing is not only them being able to document the user experience, like were they able to actually put it on? Did it work? Does this have any potential? But even more importantly, over a period of time, they were able to gather data that shows that even with just using something like this once a week, the average senior was able to improve their mobility exponentially over what it had been in just the matter of weeks. So that was very cool. It was the kind of thing that only really comes about through the relationship, but I tend to enjoy those kind of one-off, synergistic kind of opportunities that luckily come our way a lot.
That clearly they wouldn't happen without our ability to connect that dot. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a cool story. Thanks.
Yeah, I think most of what we're doing, we wouldn't have imagined doing it 10 years ago. I find often when we're kind of designing a new program and talking about it with other people in the city, we're having to kind of explain a whole industry before we can actually say, okay, and this is the program we want to do. So like with the maker movement, with design thinking, with lean methodology, all these new ideas and approaches that we're bringing in, we sort of have to explain that whole ecosystem or group or set of thinking before we can say, okay, now we explain what that is, here's what we want to do. And so a really great example of that is a program that we have helped pilot called the Learning Shelter, which is a kind of like a maker space for homeless people in San Francisco. So it was produced by a gentleman who was formerly homeless himself, and he saw a flyer to tech shop sitting in the trash and picked it up and said, oh, I wonder what this is. Used the last of his city's general assistance money to pay for a membership to tech shop. And he learned every machine in there, became a teacher, so that got him free classes. Then he just kept building up his skills to a point where he was able to keep funding his membership. And so he really saw an opportunity there that the skills that you can learn in a place like Tech Shop are really accessible to someone without a college degree. And so he designed this program called the Learning Shelter. They did a full cohort this past summer to teach people. In this case, it was folks living, there was one living in a shelter and the rest were living in SROs, which is a single resident occupancy residence in San Francisco, and he's teaching them digital manufacturing skills, and it's really inspiring to see how quickly the students really learned and came out of that. And I think that kind of program just would not have been possible without the maker movement and how far it's come, without Tech Shop. And so I think it's it's so important for us to keep being, I think, in government, to keep being these translators of these new, really kind of pushing the boundaries, these new sectors, so that we can then start to create these models that are serving sort of, the most underserved populations in our cities, because oftentimes those sectors aren't necessarily thinking about the folks that don't have, the safety net and don't have the kind of access to resources and capital that, some of the entrepreneurs and kind of innovators have. So.
To take that one step further, I've had conversations with Tech Shop about the idea of what if cities had memberships themselves to Tech Shop, and you could check them out from the library. So yet another resource that
Yeah.
Isn't that cool?